Welcome to timeline number 297. The oceans are gone. What you're standing on was once the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Let's explore what became of Earth.
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to a silence you cannot explain. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of something far larger. Something you have never once had to think about, because it has always simply been there. 70% of the surface of this planet gone. Not evaporated, not frozen. Simply gone, as though an unseen hand reached down in the night and lifted every drop of it away. No tidal wave, no warning, no explanation. Just an empty, cracked expanse where an ocean used to be. This is not a prediction. It is not a warning about the future of climate change. It is a thought experiment, one used by scientists and engineers for decades to understand a simple, unsettling truth. Civilization does not merely benefit from the ocean. It is built on top of it, held up by it, kept alive by it, in ways so fundamental that most of us never notice the foundation at all. So let us ask the question properly. What would actually happen hour by hour, year by year if the oceans disappeared overnight? To answer it, we have to look closely. Closer than we ever have before. Chapter 1. The first hour. The sun rises the same way it always has, indifferent to what has happened beneath it. But the light falling across the coastlines of the world now reveals something no human being has ever witnessed. Where there was once an unbroken horizon of blue, there is now a vast descending basin of exposed seafloor, stretching out into darkness far beyond where any coastline used to end. In port cities from Rotterdam to Singapore, container ships the length of skyscrapers sit stranded, tilted at strange angles in the mud, their hulls resting on ground that has not felt open air in millions of years. Anchors dangle uselessly from chains that once measured depth in hundreds of meters, and now measure nothing at all. Fishing boats lie scattered like toys across a drained bathtub, some capsized, some upright but permanently grounded, their nets tangled in exposed coral formations that used to lie hidden 50 meters below the surface. Along the beaches, the smell arrives before the sight fully registers. The exposed seabed begins releasing the scent of decay almost immediately, a thick, mineral, organic odor that drifts inland on a wind that no longer carries the moisture it once did. Coastal residents step outside to a horizon that makes no sense to the eye. Where the brain expects blue, it finds only a receding gray-brown plain, cracked in places, littered with the debris of a world that existed underwater for longer than humans have existed at all. Global news networks scramble to make sense of it. Satellite images pour in from orbit, showing continents now rimmed with strange new margins, their true edges revealed for the first time since the ocean first filled these basins. And on every screen, in every language, the same question echoes: how, and more urgently, what happens next? Within the hour, humanity understands one thing with total clarity. This is not a disaster confined to the coast. This is the beginning of something that will touch every single person on Earth, whether they have ever seen the ocean or not. Chapter 2. The first day. As the first day unfolds, the true scale of the collapse becomes impossible to ignore. Marine life, the vast biological engine responsible for producing more than half of the oxygen we breathe, begins dying in numbers too large to comprehend. Whales, the largest animals to have ever lived, lie stranded across newly exposed plains, their enormous bodies unable to support their own weight without water to buoy them. Coral reefs, already fragile ecosystems built over thousands of years, crumble into brittle skeletons within hours. Exposed to open air and ultraviolet light they were never built to withstand. Fisheries, an industry that feeds more than 3 billion people worldwide as a primary source of protein, cease to exist in a single morning. Ports that once processed tens of thousands of tons of seafood daily now stand empty, their docks overlooking nothing but stone and silt. But the disappearance of fish is only the beginning of the disruption. Nearly 90% of all global trade travels by sea. Container ships carry the electronics in our homes, the clothing on our backs, the oil that fuels our vehicles, the grain that becomes our bread. With the water gone, none of these vessels can move. Supply chains that took decades to build freeze in an instant, stranded mid-journey between continents that can no longer be reached by water at all. Coastal power plants, many of which rely on seawater for cooling, begin shutting down one after another. Desalination plants, which supply drinking water to over 300 million people, fall silent, their intake pipes now hanging uselessly over dry basins. By nightfall of the first day, humanity has lost its food from the sea, its primary method of global trade, a significant portion of its electricity, and a large share of its drinking water infrastructure. And this, remarkably, is still only the beginning. Chapter 3. The sky begins to change. It takes slightly longer for the atmosphere to reveal its wounds, but when it does, the changes are just as severe as anything witnessed on land. The ocean is not merely a body of water. It is the planet's primary heat reservoir, absorbing more than 90% of the excess heat trapped by the atmosphere and storing it in currents that circle the globe. Remove the ocean, and you remove Earth's thermal regulator entirely. Within days, temperature swings become extreme and unpredictable. Regions once cooled by coastal breezes and moderated by nearby seas now bake under direct, unfiltered sunlight, while other areas plunge into unusually cold nights, no longer insulated by the heat retained in ocean water after sunset. Rainfall, which depends almost entirely on evaporation from ocean surfaces, collapses. Roughly 90% of the water vapor in Earth's atmosphere originates from the sea. Without it, the water cycle as we know it grinds to a halt. Clouds thin. Rain becomes rare. Entire regions that once depended on monsoon seasons watch the sky remain empty, month after month. Hurricanes and typhoons, storms fueled by warm ocean water, simply stop forming. It might sound like a relief, but the disappearance of these storm systems removes a crucial mechanism for redistributing heat and moisture around the planet, leaving imbalances that build with nowhere to release. Seasons themselves begin to blur. Ocean currents like the Gulf Stream, responsible for keeping regions such as Western Europe far warmer than their latitude would otherwise allow, vanish along with the water that carried them. Cities once mild through winter now face temperatures more common to the heart of a continent than the edge of one. Scientists studying paleoclimate history remind us that oceans have shaped every ice age, every warming period, every significant shift in Earth's climate for hundreds of millions of years. Removing them does not simply create a drier world. It creates an unrecognizable one, climatically unmoored from everything human civilization has ever adapted to. Chapter 4. The struggle to survive. As the climate destabilizes, humanity turns to the most immediate and desperate question of all. How do we survive without the ocean? Fresh water, it turns out, was never as separate from the sea as most people assumed. Rivers, lakes, and groundwater systems are all part of a cycle that begins with evaporation from ocean surfaces. As that cycle breaks down, rainfall becomes scarce, rivers begin to run lower, and aquifers that took centuries to fill are drawn down faster than they can recover. Agriculture, already vulnerable to shifting rainfall patterns, faces catastrophic failure. Major grain-producing regions, from the American Midwest to the river deltas of Southeast Asia, depend on predictable seasonal rain cycles tied directly to ocean evaporation. As those patterns collapse, crop yields fall sharply, and food insecurity spreads from vulnerable nations to wealthy ones, with a speed few governments are prepared for. Coastal megacities, home to hundreds of millions of people, face a particularly cruel irony. Built for centuries around harbors, docks, and trade routes, they now find themselves stranded beside a dead, waterless expanse, their entire economic reason for existing suddenly gone. Populations begin moving inland, toward remaining freshwater sources and arable land, triggering the largest voluntary migration in recorded history. Economies fracture under the strain. Global trade, once dependent on shipping lanes now impossible to use, shifts entirely to overland and air transport, systems never built to handle this scale of demand. Prices for basic goods surge. Nations rich in inland agriculture and freshwater suddenly hold more geopolitical power than nations once defined by their coastlines and naval strength. And yet, amid the collapse, something distinctly human begins to emerge. Engineers work around the clock to convert desalination plants into groundwater purification systems. Farmers experiment with drought-resistant crops developed decades earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. Communities once dependent on imported food begin relearning forgotten methods of local, sustainable agriculture out of sheer necessity. Survival, it turns out, does not look like heroism in the cinematic sense. It looks like quiet, relentless adaptation, carried out by ordinary people who have no choice but to rebuild the systems that once kept them alive. Chapter 5. The Hidden World Revealed. And then, in the middle of catastrophe, something extraordinary happens. For the first time in human history, the true face of the planet lies fully exposed. Mountain ranges longer than the Andes and the Rockies combined stretch across what used to be ocean floor, their peaks and ridgelines never touched by human eyes until now. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a chain of underwater volcanic mountains running the length of the Atlantic Basin, rises into the open air as one continuous jagged spine dividing the old ocean floor in two. The Mariana Trench, deeper than Mount Everest is tall, opens into a canyon so profound that its lower reaches remain shrouded in darkness even under direct sunlight, its walls dropping nearly 7 miles into the earth. Standing at its rim, were it possible to stand there at all, a person would look down into a void deeper than any canyon ever carved by wind or river. Underwater volcanoes, some still faintly active, jut upward like blackened, jagged teeth across what used to be open water, some releasing thin trails of steam into air that has never touched them before. Entire volcanic island chains, once submerged just beneath the surface, now stand fully revealed, their slopes coated in ancient sediment and mineral deposits shaped over millions of years of underwater pressure. Shipwrecks by the tens of thousands lie scattered across the newly exposed terrain, some centuries old, perfectly preserved by cold and darkness, suddenly exposed to light and air for the first time since they sank. Ancient hydrothermal vents, chimneys of mineral rock built by superheated water rich in dissolved metals, stand silent now, their long-established ecosystems of extremophile life left gasping in an environment they were never designed to survive. Bioluminescent creatures from the deepest, darkest zones of the ocean, organisms evolved to survive total darkness and crushing pressure, are left stranded on newly dry seabeds far from any remaining water, their delicate, otherworldly bodies unable to withstand the sudden shift in pressure and light. It is, without question, one of the most visually staggering landscapes the human eye could ever witness. A geography hidden from us since long before our species existed, laid bare all at once. And it forces a sobering realization that the version of Earth we have always known, blue, oceanic, familiar, was only ever the surface layer of a much stranger and more dramatic planet underneath. Chapter 6. Years later. Years pass, and slowly, painfully, a new kind of civilization begins to take shape. The great coastal cities of the Old World, unable to sustain their populations without the trade and food the ocean once provided, shrink dramatically, or are abandoned altogether, left as sun-bleached monuments to an era defined by sea access. In their place, new population centers rise inland, clustered around the last reliable freshwater sources and the most fertile remaining farmland. Technology, driven by necessity, advances at a pace rarely seen outside of wartime. Atmospheric water generators, once niche inventions, become essential infrastructure, pulling what little moisture remains in the air and converting it into usable water. Vertical farming, engineered to require minimal water and no reliance on seasonal rain, spreads across former deserts and dried-out farmland alike, powered increasingly by solar and geothermal energy rather than fuel sources once transported by sea. International relationships transform entirely. Nations are no longer defined by their naval strength or their control of shipping lanes, but by their access to fresh water, arable soil, and renewable energy. Old alliances dissolve. New ones form around resource-sharing agreements that would have seemed unthinkable in the era of the ocean. Whether Earth's climate could ever fully stabilize again remains deeply uncertain, and scientists studying this scenario are careful to note the limits of prediction here. Some models suggest that, given enough time, alternative sources of atmospheric moisture, volcanic activity, deep groundwater outgassing, could allow a fragile new water cycle to slowly re-establish itself. Though nothing resembling the rich, ocean-driven cycle humanity evolved alongside. As for the biological world, Most marine species adapted over hundreds of millions of years to a liquid environment would not survive the initial event at all. A small number of highly adaptable organisms, certain resilient microbial life, might persist in isolated pockets of remaining moisture deep underground, but the vast, staggering biodiversity that once filled the oceans, coral reefs, kelp forests, deep-sea ecosystems, would essentially cease to exist. Recovery of anything resembling the old oceanic biosphere would not be measured in years or decades, but in geological time, if it were possible at all. And yet, humanity, defined throughout its history by an almost stubborn capacity to adapt, would very likely persist, smaller in number, reorganized around entirely new geographic and economic centers, forever changed by the memory of what was lost, but persisting nonetheless, carrying forward the hard-earned knowledge of just how fragile the balance once was. Final reflection. There is something quietly humbling in walking through this thought experiment from beginning to end. We tend to think of the ocean as scenery, a backdrop for vacations, a subject for postcards, a distant blue line at the edge of a map. We rarely think of it as infrastructure, as life support, as the single largest, quietest engine keeping the modern world running. But strip it away, even hypothetically, and the illusion dissolves almost instantly. The food on our tables, the goods in our homes, the rain that fills our rivers, the air that fills our lungs, all of it traces back, in ways both obvious and hidden, to those vast bodies of water most of us will never fully explore. We are, in the truest sense, a species shaped by the sea, whether we live beside it or 1,000 miles away from its shores. Perhaps that is the real value of imagining its disappearance. Not as a warning about some looming catastrophe, but as a reminder of a debt so large and so constant that we have simply stopped noticing it. The ocean has never asked for our attention. It has only ever quietly done its work beneath the surface, out of sight, holding up a world that has long since forgotten how much it depends on the deep.